Okay, so are you ready to dive into a real life mystery?
Always up for a good one.
Today, we're heading back to 1888 London. The fog, the gaslight, all of it. Jack the Ripper.
Ah, Jack the Ripper. A name that still sends chills down your spine, even after all these years.
Right. And you, our listeners, you want to know what makes this case legendary, what keeps us coming back to it after all this time. And honestly, I get it. Gruesome murders, an unsolved mystery, and a historical setting that's practically begging for a Netflix adaptation.
It's a perfect storm of true crime elements. And to really understand a figure like Jack the Ripper, we have to understand the world he came from.
Exactly. So we're doing a deep dive into the Wikipedia article on Jack the Ripper, and trust me, there's a lot more to uncover than you might think.
It's a fantastic place to start because to really grasp how dark this all gets, we need to see the world he was operating in.
Okay, so set the scene for us. Whitechapel, 1888. This isn't exactly the London you see on teacups, is it?
Let's just say it wasn't pretty. Whitechapel was poverty-stricken, overcrowded, think Dickens, but with more. Well, murder. Thousands of people were crammed into these awful lodging houses.
Thousands. Like, how many people are we
The
talking?
source says 8,500 people every night were crammed in, all fighting for a place to sleep.
8,000 every night. You can't even imagine being that packed in. It's almost impossible to picture.
It was grim. These weren't luxury accommodations. We're talking cramped, filthy, disease-ridden.
Yeah.
To really drive home just how bad it was, the child mortality rate in the East End was 55%.
55%. That's just heartbreaking. You can see how, for women especially, things could get desperate.
Sadly, you're right. Very few options to make a living. Prostitution became a way of life, just a means of survival for many women.
And that, of course, made them incredibly vulnerable.
Absolutely. The source actually says there were something like 62 brothels in Whitechapel alone, and over 1,000 prostitutes working the streets.
It's almost like the perfect hunting ground for someone like Jack the Ripper.
Yes, and it wasn't just poverty that created this breeding ground for fear and violence. The year before the Ripper, in 1887, there was this event called Bloody Sunday.
Bloody Sunday. What was that?
Clashes between the police and protesters demanding better living conditions. Things were already tense, volatile.
So it's like this tinderbox of social unrest, this desperation just simmering.
Precisely. And it's against this backdrop, this powder keg of a city, that Jack the Ripper's reign of terror begins. It's almost impossible to talk about Jack the Ripper without talking about the victims.
Right, because that's what he's known for. But it's not as simple as just saying 5 women, is it?
Exactly. There's actually a lot of debate about how many murders can be definitively linked to Jack the Ripper.
Yeah, like whenever you see documentaries or read about him, there's always talk about the canonical 5. But then you start digging deeper, and suddenly there are all these other victims, other cases that might be connected.
It's true, the waters get murky pretty quickly.
So for those of us who aren't experts on Victorian-era serial killers, what are the canonical 5?
So the canonical 5 are the 5 murders that experts believe, with the strongest degree of certainty, were all committed by the same person, by Jack the Ripper.
But even with those 5, you said there's debate.
Oh, absolutely. And then on top of those, you have at least 6 other murders in the same area, around the same time, that share some similarities, but also have these strange differences. It gets complicated.
Okay, so how do we even begin to untangle this web? Where does Jack the Ripper truly enter the story?
Well, we have to go back to that atmosphere of violence in Whitechapel. See, even before the 5 canonical murders, before Mary Ann Nichols, there were 2 other women murdered, Emma Smith and Martha Tabram.
And those 2 are not included in the 5.
Most experts don't think so, no. Most don't attribute those murders to Jack, at least not directly. But they're important because they highlight just how dangerous Whitechapel already was, even before Jack's reign of terror.
So those earlier murders, they're like setting the stage, a grim prologue to the main story.
That's a great way to put it. And honestly, it's one of the things that makes this case so difficult to crack. The type of violence Jack is infamous for, it didn't come out of nowhere.
So in a way, he was able to blend in because Whitechapel was already a dangerous place.
Precisely. He was able to exploit that existing vulnerability, disappear into a city already grappling with fear. But what sets the Ripper murders apart, what makes them stick in our minds even now, is the escalation, the brutality. It was almost theatrical.
It's true. Even reading through that Wikipedia article, you can't help but get pulled in by the details, however awful they might be.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about those details. What makes the canonical 5 stand out?
Well, the first of the canonical 5 is Mary Ann Nichols. Found August 31st, 1888. Her throat was slashed twice, almost severing her spinal cord. And there were the abdominal mutilations.
And it's those mutilations that really make these murders stand out, right?
They do. Although, with Mary Nichols, the mutilations weren't as extensive as some of the later victims, it was enough to shock even those accustomed to Whitechapel's violence.
It's like he was experimenting, trying to find his style. I hate to use that word, but
No, I think it's an apt comparison. Because with each murder, the violence increases. It becomes more focused, I guess you could say.
so how did the murders escalate?
Take Annie Chapman, murdered just a week after Mary Nichols. Her abdomen was completely cut open, organs removed and placed around her body. Her uterus was missing, along with parts of her bladder and vagina.
And that's where those theories about the killer being a doctor, or at least having some knowledge of anatomy, start to crop up, right?
Exactly. Though it's important to note that while the mutilations were precise, they weren't necessarily done with surgical expertise. Some experts actually believe the killer might have been a butcher, or at least familiar with animal anatomy.
Okay, so those are two of the canonical five. What about the other three? Do they fit into this pattern of escalating violence and, well, this anatomical interest?
They do, but with some head-scratching inconsistencies. Elizabeth Stride, for example, murdered September 30th. Her throat was cut, like the others, but there were no other mutilations.
So maybe he was interrupted.
That's what some people believe. Like, maybe he was forced to flee before he could finish.
It's scary to think about what else he might have done.
It is. And then there's Catherine Eddowes, killed the very same night as Stride. Her murder was especially brutal, even for Jack the Ripper.
How so?
Well, like Stride, her throat was slashed, but the mutilations were extensive. Her intestines were draped over her shoulder, a kidney was removed, and her face was slashed beyond recognition.
Didn't one of the Ripper letters mention something about a kidney?
You're right. The From Hell letter does mention the author taking a kidney. Though, whether that letter was actually from the killer or just some cruel joke, that's a whole other thing to unpack.
We'll come back to that then.
Right. For now, let's stick with the victims. That brings us to Mary Jane Kelly, generally considered to be Jack's final victim, and without a doubt the most brutal.
Her murder is the one that's really hard to forget. Even just reading the description, it's a lot to process.
It's because her murder represents a chilling escalation, even within the already horrific pattern.
What makes her murder so different?
For one, she was found in her room, not out on the street like the others. And the mutilations. They were unlike anything seen before. Her body was so badly mutilated that identification was almost impossible.
They had to rely on her clothes and things to identify her, right?
Right, and it's believed that the killer spent hours with her body after death.
God. And the fact that it happened in her own room, it suggests a level of comfort, a confidence, that's really disturbing.
It is. And then, almost as suddenly as it began, it stopped. After Mary Jane Kelly, there were no more murders that fit the same profile. No more letters claiming to be from Jack the Ripper.
But the violence in Whitechapel didn't just disappear, did it?
No, it didn't. You still had Rose Mylett, Alice Mackenzie, even the Pinchin Street torso. All of those murders happened after the canonical five.
So is it possible that Jack the Ripper was responsible for more than just the canonical five?
That's the question, isn't it? Were these later murders the work of the Ripper, his methods evolving, maybe his victims changing? Or were they copycats, capitalizing on the fear he'd unleashed? Or maybe just another tragic example of the violence that plagued Whitechapel at the time. It's hard to say for sure.
It's wild to think, trying to solve a case like this over a century later, it really shows you how much we take for granted now.
I know, right?
Imagine trying to track down a killer with nothing like what we have today. No DNA, no fancy databases.
It really makes you appreciate modern forensics, that's for sure. The police back then, they were up against it. A city on edge, rumors flying everywhere, and a killer who seemed to vanish into thin air.
Plus, their investigative tools were practically ancient compared to what we have now.
It was a completely different world. Thousands of potential witnesses, all those interviews.
The Wikipedia article mentions over 2,000 interviews. Can you imagine? Trying to find a needle in a haystack doesn't even begin to cover it.
And the pressure they must have felt. With each passing day, the newspapers were breathing down their necks, churning out new theories and suspects every few hours. It's no wonder public opinion started to shape the investigation.
Well, that's what happens when a story captures the public imagination like that. And speaking of which, we have to talk about the whole leather apron thing.
Oh yeah, the leather apron. A classic example of how quickly fear and speculation can take on a life of their own, especially when you've got the media fanning the
It
flames.
does sound like something straight out of a Penny Dreadful, doesn't it? The name alone, Leather Apron. It conjures up these images of some shadowy, sinister figure.
Exactly. It plays into all those fears, those stereotypes people had.
And the newspapers, they didn't exactly shy away from those stereotypes, did they?
Not at all. They ended up focusing on this local Jewish man, a leather worker, which just fueled the anti-Semitism that was already bubbling under the surface.
It's a good reminder that sometimes the most sensational story, the easiest target, isn't always the right one.
Very true. But while the leather apron might have been a media invention, the name Jack the Ripper, well, that's another story altogether.
Right, because that came directly from those letters. Or at least it was in those letters, whoever actually wrote them.
The Dear Boss letter. That's
Yeah.
where the name first pops up, September 1888. And regardless of whether the letter was actually from the killer, it stuck.
It's like he branded himself.
Exactly. Suddenly, Jack the Ripper wasn't just a killer, he was a media phenomenon.
And let's not forget, there wasn't just the Dear Boss letter. There was the Saucy Jackie postcard, the From Hell letter. It was like he was toying with everyone.
Oh, absolutely. He was playing a game with the police, the press, with the entire city. And in a way, he was winning because regardless of whether he wrote those letters or not, they worked. They terrified people. They kept the whole city on edge.
And the newspapers, they loved it, didn't they?
Are you kidding? They ate it up. The source says some papers were selling over 1 million copies a day during the peak of the Ripper panic.
1 million! That's insane. It goes to show that, in a way, Jack the Ripper was a product of his time. The rise of mass media, this insatiable appetite for sensationalism, he was practically tailor-made for it.
And that's part of what makes this case so fascinating even now. It's not just about the murders themselves, but about how those murders were consumed by the public, how they became a way to understand the anxieties, the fears of Victorian society.
And here we are, well over 100 years later, still talking about him, still trying to figure him out. Why do you think that is? Why are we still so drawn to Jack the Ripper?
I think it's because, at its core, this story is about the unknown, the unknowable. It's the ultimate unsolved mystery. And I think it forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths about ourselves, about the potential for darkness, for violence that exists even in the most civilized societies.
And maybe, just maybe, some questions are better left unanswered.
Maybe some mysteries are just too big, too unsettling to ever be fully solved.
That's definitely a chilling thought to end on. So, to all our listeners out there, we ask you this. What will you take away from this deep dive into the shadowy streets of Whitechapel? What sticks with you? What will you be pondering the next time you find yourself walking through a foggy city? We may never truly know who Jack the Ripper was or why he did what he did, but in searching for those answers, we uncover something about ourselves, about our own fascination with the macabre, with the shadows that linger long after the lights have come on. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the past.